awesome. And thank you all for being here. Hold on, I'm going to do this so I can see all of you. 1 second. Okay, there I am. The book actually comes out on the 8th. You can order it now. I had sent Richard an early copy, so that's how he was able to read it. But came out in the UK about a month and a half ago, and I can actually show you. I don't know if you can see this. Can you see this? Okay, there you go. So that's what it looks like. And we were lucky enough to get a whole bunch of wonderful testimonials from many people who you might know, both in the Jewish community and outside, as well as a number of academics. Which has been terrific. So anyway, wait 1 second. I want to just turn off my little thing so I'm not staring at myself. I hate that. Okay, good. About 9 years ago, something like that. Yeah, 8-9 years ago, my husband and I had a liquidity event, and his company went public, and he was eventually able to sell his stock. My company, I sold my company. It was in the fertility business. And overnight we found, well, actually about a week or two ahead of time, we thought if this goes through, we're going to be all of a sudden become wealthy people. And we had never been wealthy people before. We were both solidly middle class families. I was from Los Angeles. My husband was from Toronto. And we were sort of paycheck to paycheck kind of people. So I didn't really know of, we didn't starve, we were fine, but we certainly weren't machers, and we weren't people who were donating to Federation. We weren't, the way I describe it is we weren't on the list. So what happened is we found out we were going to be wealthy. We decided that we wanted to, well, it wasn't that we wanted to make a donation. It just seemed obvious that if you're wealthy, you have an obligation to. So, which I've since heard is not, everybody doesn't think that way, but we thought everybody did. And so I said about a week before, I said, why don't we figure out, assuming this happens, why don't we each pick one really big donation we both want to make, something that's really important to us, and we'll each pick one. And then after that, we can figure it out from there. And so he picked a donation to, and for those of you who've read the book, I think there's just a couple of you here, sorry to repeat this, but it's still a good story. So he chose the Crohn's, to do something with Crohn's research. He's had Crohn's disease since he's been about 12 years old, had numerous surgeries, and he wanted to find a way that children wouldn't have to go through what he went through as being diagnosed as a child. And so he wanted to find the very best research that was around relative to Crohn's disease. And so I did some research, and I realized that our local hospital, even though he was going to go to Stanford or to Mayo or something, we found out that our local hospital, which is also a world-renowned hospital, Cedars-Sinai, actually had just brought in somebody from London who was amazing and was doing research in IBD genetics, so it's genetics of irritable bowel disease. And that seemed great. And so I thought, okay, great. We're going to give them a big bunch of money, and we'll figure out what they need it for and what research and that kind of thing. So parallel to that, at the same time, I was on the board of our synagogue, a fairly large synagogue, been involved for a long time, and was very close to the staff and the rabbis. And I decided that I remember as a kid, my father had taken me to another synagogue, a conservative synagogue. We're Reformed now, but a conservative synagogue, when I was like 5 years old, to go see my grandfather's plaque on the wall. And that was a really important thing. And my dad died when I was pretty young. And I thought, you know what, I want to do something with the synagogue with my dad's name. And they were completing a capital campaign, and they needed about $1 million to complete the capital campaign. And I knew that because not only was I on the board, but I was incoming president. And so I wanted that to be successful. And I thought, hey, I can actually do that. So we decided that we would do a major donation to Cedars-Sinai for Crohn's research, and we would do a donation to the synagogue to be able to complete this capital campaign where they were restoring our sanctuary. And so on a particular day, we decided to start working on that. And the first thing I did is I called the synagogue, and I called the rabbi, and I said, I just want to let you know I have great news for you. And she said, what? And I said, well, we've sat down and decided, Josh and I have decided, and we, assuming this thing goes through next week, we would like to complete the capital campaign and give you the money to complete that. And I couldn't even believe the words were coming out of my mouth because it was so unusual for me. I wasn't from that, but it was like, I can do this thing. And she said, I don't know what to say. And that was not what I expected. And I thought, that's really strange. And I said, well, I guess you could say thank you. And she says, well, yes, but I don't know what to do with this. And I said, what do you mean you don't know what to do with this? And she said, well, I didn't make an ask. And at that point, I thought, wow, something is really wrong here. If you didn't make the ask, so I can't just go to you and say, hi, I would like to give you money. And at the same exact time, at Cedars-Sinai, I had called, and I called the head of medicine's office. They sent me to somebody else who sent me to somebody else. I ended up being put with somebody kind of a mid-range person, I think, in the development department. This is a very sophisticated place. And I told him what we were looking to do, but I really didn't know how much money it was. I would like to see some presentations. And we did end up giving them a multi-million-dollar gift to endow a chair, which I didn't know what that was before, but we found out what that was in IBD research that has been very successful. But it took almost 7 months for them to accept our money. I called and emailed and tried and waited, and they'd say, we'll give you this. And occasionally we would have a meeting and they'd say, okay, we're going to work on it. We'll get back to you. And because I wasn't on the list that I talked about at the beginning, they just, I don't know if they didn't believe us or they just didn't know what to do with us. And in both cases, we were people who had walked in with money and, or not, I don't know what they thought, but they hadn't gone through their typical process. They hadn't gone through their screens and their lists and their asks, and they're bringing a friend and they're having a lunch and that whole big thing. And at that point, my husband and I both coming from business, I thought something's very wrong here. I don't understand this. And it seems very, very strange. So we learned a little bit more about philanthropy, and I asked some more questions. And I had somebody say to me, well, you can't ever treat a nonprofit like a business. And I thought that was very strange. And then it took even though the stockbrokers and the wealth managers took them about under 24 hours to find us after our IPO. And so the calls were coming in, and I was sure I was going to get many more calls from charities and nonprofits, and I didn't get none, for about a year and a half. And at that point, I was also on the board of our local Jewish Community Foundation. So it wasn't that I wasn't involved. By, let's say, about 2 months later, I was on that board. I didn't make a big deal about it, but it was on my bio, and nobody figured it out that we were there. And so again, it was about a year and a half later that finally Federation called and said, oh, hi, yeah, we understand that you're around. And I thought, I don't understand. How could you not have known that I was there for a year and a half? And it was very, very awkward. So, so after that, and after getting a whole lot of emails, as many of you who are donors, or probably all of you know, and getting emails, dear John, or dear, whatever, my name, dear Jane, or emails that had 5 different fonts and different colors, or parts where you get sections that have been, copied from a previous letter, like a form letter, and you can tell it because it's a different font. I looked at all this and I thought, this is really arcane and strange. I don't understand. And at the same time, I'm at a synagogue and I'm involved in nonprofits, and everybody's saying, we need more money, we need more money. We have to get these donors to give more. And around a year into it, 2 years into it, a very prominent donor in Los Angeles passed away. He was in his 90s. And I heard that Federation had something like 40% of their revenue was coming from this guy. So, and then I also, with my business brain, I thought, wait a minute, that's a problem. I mean, he's 90. How could they not have known something was going to happen? And it's not like there was a foundation already, it was already set up so that automatically that money would come in from his family or other people. So I thought that this is very, very strange. So I started doing some checking, and I asked a number of donors, have you had these kinds of experiences? Or even the long-term donors, have you had the things where somebody comes to a meeting and they're not prepared and they ask you, oh, how did you get your money? Which is crazy in this day and age. Or they, all sorts of things. Or they ask for a ridiculous amount of money that has nothing to do with what we do. Or they push really hard to get me to interact with them, but what they represent is something that it's not my thing. I'm not involved in that particular area. And so after a while, I really said, I'm very, very concerned. I've been on the boards of lots of nonprofits. I volunteered for a long time. But if this continues, I'm worried that another big wealthy donor, or 5 of them, who are really sustaining some of these big institutions, that they pass away. And all of a sudden, all of those organizations under them, all of those hundreds, thousands of organizations who depend on contributions from those big organizations and institutions overnight will just go away. And I was really concerned. And then I thought, well, wait a second. So maybe they're bringing in a new world of young people to come in and take the place of that. And I found out that I actually knew at this point that wasn't really happening. That really there were two choices. If you're a fundraiser, it was, well, we can go and learn the new language of young people. And since I came from tech, I knew a lot about that kind of thing, and a lot of our friends, and in fact, my husband were younger than me. And so you can learn that new language of technology and accept that and really honor it. Or you can just ask the older guys who have been there for a long time, who are in their 80s or whatever, and you can just ask them for a little bit more money. And when I asked a couple of fundraiser friends, they said, oh my gosh, the second one is so much easier, just to ask them for a little bit more money. And I thought, but that's not sustainable. That doesn't make any sense. So I went to a lot of organizations and said, why are you not spending, well, what are you doing with young people? Why are you not spending more time really working with sort of, the Google mid-managers and the Amazon people and whatever. And they really didn't want to do that. And in fact, told me that, well, millennials don't give money, which is just not true. So then I went to the millennials and I said, well, how do you feel about giving? And I heard this horrible story that's in my book about a young woman who was a kind of a mid-level manager at, I think, Google or Facebook or one of those. And they had a job fair. Instead, they had a nonprofit fair. So, you go into a big room and there's various nonprofits around, and you go and talk to them and see if maybe you want to get involved with them. And this particular woman who we found through actually various different people, including my daughter, was about in her early 20s. What the person didn't know on the other end of the table, or what people didn't know, is that she also had inherited a large amount of money. And so she had not only money in her own right, but she also had money from the family. And she went up to one of these booths, and she knew in advance, she looked at the list of who was going to be there. She went up to one of the booths with the nonprofit that she was interested in, and she said, hello, my name is whatever it was, and I'd like to talk to you about being part of your board of directors. And the woman on the other side said, what could you at your age possibly contribute to our board of directors? And makes my stomach hurt. I just couldn't believe it. And then I talked to another friend and I said, we were doing some political fundraising, and she was working with the Asian community. And I said, well, where does the Asian community, other than politics, what do they give to? These are people, large donors, they're very low key. And they work with her. She's also Asian and has been doing this for a long time. And I said, who do they, are there pet projects or organizations for that community that you work with? And she said, no. And I said, well, what kinds of things do they give to? She said, they don't. And I said, what do you mean they don't? And she said, nobody ever asks them. And so that was very, very strange. And so I thought, wait a minute, a lot of this money is coming from the same people over and over again. And we're not focusing on the rest of the world, like that this pie can actually be much, much larger. It actually is much larger. We're just not doing the right things to try and interact with those people, because it's kind of easier to do what you know. And what you know is to do the same thing over and over again, the way it's been done for, I don't know, 50, 60, 70 years. So that made me very, very concerned. And then I thought, well, what about the heads of these organizations? Are they, they must know this is happening. They must know that sometime in the next 8 to 12 years, what's going to hit the fan, that money's going to go away, and they are going to be, and all of a sudden all these organizations will go out of business overnight. And so why aren't they working harder to bring in new donors from other places? And what I found out is that for many of these institutions, not all, but for many of them, their retirement is going to be right about at the time in this next 8 to 10 years when these other people will be gone. So they're kind of kicking the can down the road. And I decided somebody needs to sound the alarm, or this time of year, sound the shofar, and say, you know what, you've got to wake up. And I thought I had a few years to do that. And then COVID happened. And I realized that, oh my gosh, some of this is happening right now. So someone told me I was very clever to write the book in 2 months. It actually took a few years. But what I also realized is, hey, I have a book here that I can use. It can be a handbook that actually says, instead of doing this, do this. Instead of doing this, do this. from a donor's perspective and has a lot of these stories from my perspective and about 40 other donors and academics that can actually help people to start to turn that ship right now when there's existential threats abounding. So that's what this is about. And we've been working I've got a number of advanced copies. We're working to get them to as many nonprofits around the world, really, but mostly in the United States, as many as possible, so that they can actually have this information and help their organizations immediately. A girlfriend of mine in Israel called me a few months ago, and she said she also was one of our testimonial people, and so she had the manuscript. And she said that she went on an online seminar that she runs a nonprofit, pretty good sized nonprofit, and she went online and went to the seminar about whatever the subject was. And it cost a little bit of money, or it was free, I don't remember which, and it was about an hour. And she said by about 50 minutes into it, she was super frustrated. And she said, oh my gosh, I can't believe this is like not getting me anywhere. And then the last few minutes, they said, well, if you really want to know the important stuff, you can pay this X amount of dollars and you can take our part 2 series. So she was really angry, and she decided, wait a second, I think Lisa wrote about that. And she opened up the book and she said, whatever the subject was, that the book had a solution to her problem in 4 minutes. And that's what we want to be doing. So we want to be able to give people something, put it out in the world and say, this is going to give you something that will help you. And it's all based on, like I said, how donors really feel, and helping fundraisers understand how donors see things. It's not about being, kissing up to donors or any of those kinds of things, but it's really about creating a real, honest, equal partnership with donors of all ages, all backgrounds, all different types, because right now there's about $130 billion sitting in donor advised funds. And I believe that it is billion, by the way, if you didn't know that. And I believe that a lot of that is because somebody had one interaction like my 7 months thing, or well, we didn't ask you, and they say, forget it, I'm done. I'm going to leave the money in my donor advised fund, or I'm going to give it to my cat, end of story. And I'm trying to fix that. So that's me.
So Lisa, that's terrific. Thanks very much, because it really laid out some important issues, and a number of questions and comments have already come in. So I want to start with one, picking up on a comment that was made early on. First of all, there was a very strong thank you for your family commitment to fighting Crohn's disease. It touches people personally. One of the people on this call, it touches very personally, and there was a tremendous appreciation for what you are doing in that area. But then I want to move on to an interesting dilemma that comes up in something else that you talked about. And one person said, well, gee whiz, how do you deal with donor intent? Because the comment that the person put in the chat had to do with somebody who had died, and it was clear that the person who died had a very strong opinion that the children or the next generation didn't honor. Whether it had been articulated or whether it was just implicit wasn't clear. I'm going to contrast that with a foundation with which I had worked on a basis that they came in because they were struggling with an issue. It was about to go from a $30 million to a $600 million foundation within a very brief period of time. I know that's chump change for this group, but that was a lot of money in that state where that foundation was. And everybody was paralyzed because the surviving matriarch wouldn't tell them what they wanted to do, what she wanted to do, and they were paralyzed until when I got there. It turned out she said, "I don't understand what everybody's worried about. I'm telling them that I don't want to tell them what they should do with it, because when I look at my life and see how it's changed, how can I anticipate what's going to happen over the next 2 generations so that I should tie their hands with my intent?" So I think what we find is there's a dialectic tension between understanding whether people should be, as it were, controlling from the grave, or whether the process of moving from generation to generation should really liberate the next generations to respond anew. So I wonder if you would talk about that. That was implicit, and we'll come to other questions in a minute. We wanted to pick up on that.
Well, okay, so the second way, I just love that because my best example of you don't know what's coming down the pike, and so I'm not going to tell you, and I think that person was very wise. Best example of that is COVID, right? So right now we have something that nobody could have anticipated that requires large amounts of money and that really is a save the world kind of thing and impacts everybody. and nobody could have known that in advance. I mean, maybe, you know, the epidemiologists, but whatever. I mean, really what this was going to be, it couldn't be known. So I think that there needs to be a respect for, you know, she did a very severe version of that, saying, you know, I don't want to give you any direction, which you know, made people confused. I'm sorry they were paralyzed, because all I can think about is the money that didn't go to a nonprofit for some period of time, and that makes me very sad and disturbed. But
I wouldn't worry about that. They were not paralyzed about not spending money. What they were not prepared to do is what to do when it became a $600 million foundation
right.
versus when it was a $30 million foundation, and they realized that that was a particularly qualitatively different challenge than they had before.
Yeah, and I think a lot of this is talking to your kids and being good models for your children. I think also it's about teaching kids about philanthropy at a young age. We started donor advised funds for our children when they were about 5, and worked with them, and it has to be age appropriate. So from the time they were 5 to maybe 10, they only wanted to give donor advised fund gifts when there was something that came with it, like World Wildlife Fund gives you little fuzzy stuffed animals, or somebody would give you some plants or, you know, seeds or something. And so that's fine for that age. And but I think that it's instilling that that sort of feeling of community and responsibility, and really the Jewish responsibility to your community and to your world, and then, you know, and then you can tweak it with kind of what part of that is about you. But I think the other one, but the one where they didn't honor the parents' wishes, is that right? They actually just didn't, right?
They ignored them. It wasn't that they picked. Yeah. We don't know whether the parent had articulated them. They had just behaved a certain way, funded a certain way, yeah. And the next generation just didn't follow that lead. So
yeah, I mean, you know, my opinion on that is the world changes, and you've kind of got to go with it, what different needs are. But, you know, people, if this person had been interested in, you know, worked at food banks and interested in feeding people, I don't think it would be asking a lot of the children to say, you know what, they were interested in food banks and feeding people. So, or they were interested in supporting Jewish life. I mean, those kinds of things, I think to ignore that completely, or to say, hey, we've got this bunch of money, we can do whatever we want, I think that's also wrong. So that's sort of painful. From the institution point of view, who they give to, because I'm guessing you're sort of working around that area, that, you know, saying it has to be this way. My favorite story of that is at Harvard. I'm sure many of you might know the story about the library, and I can't remember the name of the library, but one of you probably know. And that somebody came and they gave a large amount of money for this library because the son, I think they're people from Philadelphia, I believe, and the son had died in the Titanic, and he was a book collector. So they decided to make this library in honor of him, and built the building, but they had these rules that came with it. And the rules were, is there anybody here who doesn't know this story? You can raise your hand if you don't know this story. It's like, okay, good. So the rules were that the footprint of the building could not be moved 1 inch. It had to always stay exactly that footprint. And that inside of the building, that there were the stacks of books and all that was used as a library, but inside there would be this single room that would have some of these special books, I guess, in it, with a little table in it. And it was dedicated to this son. I think he was in his early 20s when he died. With, I think it was a single red rose or a bunch of roses or something. This sounds like it's not even real, but it's actually true. I know people who've seen it. And then there was one guy who was made the caretaker of this particular room, who went in and made sure the flowers were fresh and did that thing. And that was it. And then all of a sudden, digital media comes around, and the books need to be digital, and there's stacks, and people aren't necessarily going for that, and they need to have technology. And you've got this little room, and the whole thing didn't make any sense. And it was really kind of, and I thought that's just so sad, you know, and they wanted to make some changes to make the building make more sense. Again, this is however many, 80 years ago, and they couldn't do anything. It was absolutely, and I forgot what the penalty was, but there was some severe penalty to the institution if they didn't do exactly what those person's words were. And so I'm sure they felt really, you know, obviously, you know, unbelievable trauma about their child dying, but to put that on that university and not think about what is this university really about, and have that kind of marriage of what do we want to remember and what is the institution need, I think that needs to be part of that equation, and it really wasn't in that particular case. So, but it still stands, and you can go to Harvard and they'll tell you about it.
one of the things is, and I'm going to switch to a derivative question, at least in a minute, but one of the things that we as funders have to do is make it safe for nonprofit organizations to tell us the truth. In other words, that we have a burden of responsibility not to so intimidate potential donors or potential recipients, or to come across as so judgmental that they don't tell us what they really need or what's really going to be successful. And there's a sycophant nature that we have to resist. And we as funders have to make that possible. But I'm going to shift that, because you put a couple things on the table that some people responded to. So, and I'm going to ask them in two different ways and let you come at them, everyone. One is, how do people find people like you? I mean, you were willing to be outspoken at a certain point, but on the other hand, you were outspoken with places which you found on your own. There probably were organizations that didn't find you. And so some people would like to figure out, if you were in their shoes, what should they have been doing to find you? And what then is it, and what do you find compelling when people speak to you? What's credible? That doesn't mean you're going to fund them all, but there's cases that are more credible than others. What do you as a funder find credible as you hear people's pitches?
Okay. So the first part is, how do people find people like me? First of all, I am, at the beginning, when I started to write the book, or decided to write the book, really what it started with is me just ranting every morning to my friends as I was driving into whatever work thing I was doing, because I was so upset about this. And then I eventually said, well, that's not fair to my friends. I should actually, record it. And then I decided to write it down. And then, but along the way, talking to those friends, many who were donors and many who were nonprofit leaders, I realized that I kind of confirmed what I thought was true, which is, I am not unusual. I am not the only part about me that I think is unusual is that I sat through 7 months of trying to get a place to take my money. Most people would not have done that. But as far as having money and not having anybody really talk to you, like the Asian people I talked about earlier who said they don't ask, that's super common. Really, really, really common. Or not talking to the 20-something-year-old and not treating them like a human. So, which brings me to sort of the next piece is, well, someone had asked how you get to people like me. I have something in the book called a 5-minute Google search. I might trademark that at some point, I don't know, which means ignore all the other screens that you've ever heard, other than, is the person part of our community? But the typical screens that most nonprofits use are your political party, and people pay a lot of money for this, your political party, your political donations, and the value of your home. And I can explain later, but really, if you look at those, all three are irrelevant, because they really don't tell you what that person's capacity is. But what is important is, what do they like? What's their family about? What do they do? What other organizations do they give to? All of those kinds of things. And that you can typically find out in a 5-minute Google search. And so I recommend that everybody who's running a nonprofit first looks to your own group of people in your own mailing list and do a 5-minute Google search, because in most organizations, you don't really know most of those people. You might know 5 or 10% of them. And I would just about guarantee, especially with the stock market being up, that somewhere in those other 80, 90, 95% of people that you don't know are people just like me, and that nobody's ever asked them, so they just don't give. So wait, did that answer your question?
So that's part of it. I'll come back to that in a minute. But the other part of it was, once somebody does find you or other funders, what makes it a compelling case? There are people on this group, it happens, are very involved in Limmud, but, and I think it's great to talk about how Limmud becomes a compelling case, but I think we're going to go beyond that. What comes across as credible and compelling when somebody actually does finally sit down and talk to you?
Right. So the first thing is treating the other person like a human being. I relate this to I think it's Us or People magazine does this thing, and they say celebrities, they're just like us. And I think it's important to realize that these are regular people. They really are. Some of them have developed some sort of bad traits after they've had money for a long time, but most of them are just regular people. And if you treat them like regular people as opposed to like an alien, that's blue or something else, then you will have a much better time, a much better chance of success. The other thing is, there's a couple things. Do your homework, kind of understand who that person is, and be honest with yourself that if when you do the research and find out who that person is, what they're about, and what it looks like they're interested in, and that's not what you're selling, just let it go, or have a meeting with them and say, hey, I'm involved in other nonprofits or with other nonprofit leaders. Maybe I can direct you to somebody at this other institution, and even call the other institution, say, hey, let me make a shidduch between the two of you. But don't push something down their throat when it's not something that they're likely to be interested in. But one of the most important things, and in addition to that, is just being authentic. So treating the other person like a human being, and being honest and being authentic. You can say, my organization's been having a lot of trouble with A, B, and C, and it won't make them look at you differently and say, a lot of people think, well, they'll say, well, I don't want to give to you because your organization's, screwed up. It's not. The donor is going to look at that and say, oh my gosh, finally somebody who's honest and is telling me really what's going on, and find out, does that donor want to be involved? Does the donor want to know where the money goes? Does the donor want to know, what is it? And you're really developing an actual authentic relationship. But the only caveat with that is, once you do that, that is like a friendship, and you have obligations to continue to be honest to that person. And if you know that person wants to be called every 2 months and told what's going on, then you need to do that. So don't get involved with the relationship if you're not ready to be the person on the other side of it. But it works beautifully if you follow at least those few directions.
So I think I'm going to underscore a couple of things that you said, Lisa, because it's so important, and people are already commenting and nodding about how important it is. So number one, aside from the search process of finding people who have of means, and I want to make a comment about that in a minute, but it's important, once you have that discussion, to accept that your compelling case might not be a priority to that other person. And as compelling as your case is, doesn't mean that that's going to make them want to fund you. It's a legitimate, there's so many things that are legitimate needs and interests. It's okay. It's not a personal rejection if they decide they want to go another direction. And it's not even a sense that somehow you've made a bad sales pitch. It may be that the priorities are different. But the other thing that you said is that if you want the funders to treat those who want the money as and tell you the truth, then the nonprofit organizations have to also speak honestly. They have to tell the story honestly. They have to tell what the real challenges are. They have to tell what might not work, why this is a risk at this time, or why this is a priority at this time. It's very important that the honesty goes both ways, and it's a genuine dialogue. The funder says what they're really looking for. The nonprofit says honestly whether that's deliverable, and there's something that goes on between them. Now I want to pick up. I know that Stu wanted to come in and has some comments on some things, but before we get to that, you talked about both the Jewish world and the non-Jewish world, and I'm curious whether you perceive or experience this differently in the Jewish world from the non-Jewish world.
No. In fact, our book was actually published in the UK, and we had to go even beyond that because I had to, somebody I met through Jewish social justice work was actually our agent, but I thought, okay, the Jewish world and the non-Jewish world seem to be sort of similar, but for sure in the UK it's going to be different, or for sure in Australia it's going to be different, or for sure in Israel. And guess what? Not so different, like little fine-tuning kinds of things, but this pretty much exists everywhere. And I don't understand why in the Jewish world, when we're all about understanding each other, that's a basic tenet, that these conversations, these authentic conversations, just don't happen more often.
Okay. Stu, I'm going to ask you to unmute if you'd rather just leave your comment as it is, or okay. I mean, I think that just, I'm sorry to put you to, that Stu felt that maybe we had whether there's been better and more sincere efforts on the part of the nonprofit organizations along the years, that it's not quite as extreme as portrayed. That there are nonprofit organizations that know how to do it, that are successful at it, that have a good record, and there are others that aren't. And just, I think there was a sensitivity about not painting too broad a brush with that, but rather to take the best lessons from the ones that are doing it right and the correctives for the ones that are not doing it right, rather than to paint too broad a brush about the sector as a whole.
Yeah, so I'm not suggesting that everybody's doing it wrong. I'm suggesting that a lot of people are doing parts of it wrong. And one of the big ways that they can learn to do it better, and I say wrong because just as a donor, it feels wrong. It's not compelling, but at least to me and to you read the book, there's 40 other people in there, including academics who see the same thing. But I do think that, yes, they can learn from each other, but I was astonished that most of them don't learn from their donors. That the donors, for some reason, don't speak up, and that's probably the donor's fault, but they don't actually say how they feel. They don't actually answer those questions. For example, like, why did you not give to my organization? Why did that not happen? Most donors I talked to said that it was easier to just hang up the phone and go on to the next organization, and that doesn't help anybody. So I think that that yes, there's some people who are doing it right. Yes, there's some people who are looking at the same thing that I'm looking at. But on the whole, the methodology of that worked for an earlier generation of people that's being taught today is it just doesn't work anymore. And until people start saying, it's just not fair to say millennials don't give money or Gen Xers don't give enough money or whatever, because we don't know that. And we do know that it's increasing every year what they're giving. And so I think we need to really realize that there's other opportunity out there, a whole lot of opportunity out there that we're just not accessing.
Okay, so I want to go back to something that you said in your presentation that we didn't pick up on yet. And that is what you recognized and your husband recognized, that there are different ways in which we communicate with people at different stages of their life and different life experiences. So I wonder whether you want to share some thoughts about some of the, I don't like these Gen X and Gen Y. I don't want to put it in wholesale terms, but what are some of the insights you had about dealing with different either age groups or generation groups, or even within families, Gen 2s, Gen 3s, about how organizations might approach them authentically?
Right. So it's different depending on who you are, right? And it doesn't go strictly by age lines, kind of like you were saying. It does a little bit. You know, if you say to a Gen Xer, as most of you, probably all of you know, you call them on the phone. I actually have gotten these phone calls, and I get a voicemail that says, "Hi, this is so and so from XYZ organization. You don't know me, but please call me back." That's a little bit crazy. I don't use the phone that much, and I'm not going to call them back when I know. Oh, they even said, and I'm a development officer, I'm not going to call an organization I know nothing about to have them ask me for money. It just seems a little weird to me. Now, if they do that to my mother, that's probably going to work more likely because she's much more comfortable on the phone. So one of the things that I suggest everybody does is ask whoever you're talking to, whatever age they are, how do you like to be communicated with? And honor that. So some people like to be communicated with by text. Some people do better. And I learned this at 2 businesses ago where we were communicating with lots of actually young people and they weren't responding to our calls and we didn't understand. And this is like 15 years ago at this point when I was in the fertility business. And we realized, oh, if we just ask them how they want to be communicated with, some are emails, some are Facebook, some are whatever, and then you communicate with them that way. And that already makes a huge difference because it means that the person is looking at you as a person who has particular needs. And I think also it's then understanding what's that person really about? Like, how do they, or do they have sort of a business mind? What is their background? Are they somebody who is going to want to know who your competition is in your area, in your sector that you work in? And by the way, that's a question that I ask all the time. And most of the time I get a blank stare, even from really big renowned organizations that they just don't know. And I always do the research before I go to a meeting to find out who their competition is. But when they don't know, that makes me not feel so great about them. So I think that it has to be on a personal basis. And one of my piece I wanted to kind of give to everybody is, regardless of how old they are or how much money they have or whatever, treat them as you would want to be treated yourself. And I actually said this to somebody the other day who called me and said, I want to know what subject line to put in that's going to be compelling. And I said, well, look at your email. So she was worried because I have a blog and I write articles every week, and it was about the subject line and how important that is to opening up emails for people who do emails. And so she said, I have this subject line. How is that? So, they give us money or whatever. And I said, well, okay, think of yourself in the morning, you turn on your computer, you've got 100 emails, whatever it is. And if that one was there, would you just automatically delete that? If your name was on it and it said the exact same subject line, what would you do with that? And if you wouldn't open it yourself, then don't send it out. And so think of like I call it sort of looking in the mirrors. Think about what the person on the other end, if they were you, if you were giving this pitch to you, how would you feel about that? And that will answer most of the rest of the questions.
Good. One thing I want to assure you, Lisa, is I know you don't have time to look at the chat, but people are enthusiastic about signing up for the book. Apparently, one person has put the Kindle link in. I understand that you have, those of us who write about philanthropy a lot, it's nice to endorse other people's work as well. You have a blog and a website, and if you look at the chat, everybody, you'll be able to see it. So it looks as if you'll have a good group of additional readers after this presentation. We're coming down to the last few minutes. Lisa, first of all, anybody, I just want to make sure I didn't omit anybody's comments or questions. I think I got everybody in, but if not, taking a quick look here, I think.
Can I just answer Joni's question real quick?
Sure.
So first of all, Joni, thank you for putting in the name. I think it's pronounced Widner Library. Is that right? Widener Library. Yeah. So thank you for that, because that is the one. But I think, how do you convince donors that it's yours? And again, hopefully you've already gotten that answer. It's that, that they should support you. It's first you find out who they are and if this is the right thing for them. And if you can do that, then you have to be willing to accept that. And I got to tell you, a guy called me the other day, and an Orthodox man actually who does fundraising in New Jersey, and he's picked me up online and had a question, and he said, well, I called this person, I said, how are you doing with COVID? And started talking about them, and he wanted them to donate. And the person says, well, what did you say? And he says, well, I just said, how are you doing with COVID? And she said, oh my gosh, nobody asks me that. So she explained what had happened, and she actually needed something, some type of care or whatever it was. And he said, even though he's a fundraiser and being paid to be a fundraiser, he said, okay, let me help you with that. Let me give you this referral and whatever. And the person couldn't believe it. And I guarantee you was going to donate to him. So, but he felt guilty for making that referral and for not just saying, give to this organization. And I said, you are not allowed to feel guilty for that. So we have to just put more humanity into this.
Yeah, I mean, we know that, but I've done a lot of fundraising over the years for a lot of different organizations, and you know the hook, where to get the hook in. One of the things that has bothered me is with one of our situations here. I get called all the time to donate to this organization, and in fact, I will never donate to them again, because what they did was, a couple of years ago, they gave their outgoing director a bonus of $1.5 million because they decided that his salary wasn't commensurate with others in the past, even though his salary was 10 times what many people were making at the time. And he walked away with a $1.5 million, golden parachute. And I said, I'm giving that money so kids can go to Jewish day schools, and you're taking money away from Jewish day schools saying you don't have it, and that's where it's going. I'm done with you. And a lot of people felt that way. And what we're trying to do is make people understand that we're not a medical need, we're not Crohn's, and thank you so much, as the mother of a kid who suffers greatly. Yeah. And we're not cancer, but we provide a really valuable service, especially with COVID, with doing this remotely. There are so many people who have called me and said, oh my God, thank you for alerting me to this. I find I'm so bored. I have nothing to do all day, and now I have this. So
good stuff. And I think one of the questions I ask when I hear about these $1.5 million whatever, and of course there might be information you don't know, is how did that impact their mission by giving him that money? So if you kind of think of it that way, is how, please explain to me, how does that help your mission? So anyway, thank you for all you do. It's really
thank you
great.
For your book. I actually just recommended it to a friend of mine who's the head of development for the American Psychiatric Association, and she said, sounds like a great one. I just ordered it.
Thank you. And please join my blog. Yeah.
The one thing I want to add to that discussion, though, is that it's very important for us as funders, those of us who are funders, to not look only at what we might consider to be overpay at the top, but underpay at the bottom.
Correct.
that is absolutely correct.
And there's a tendency in the nonprofit world, and it includes the Jewish world, to somehow not recognize that there are people that are not making a living wage, who are working all the time. And if my priority when I teach funders and when I advise funders is, I have no issue, Joni, with what you said, but I also, I think it's as important, or maybe more important, to make sure that the personnel practices of that organization respect all the people that are working there, and not just respect the senior people.
You're right. You're absolutely right.
If we had more time, I would be happy to give many real examples of that, but I think it's important.
I want to give one statistic about that you probably know, Richard, or maybe some of you know, is that they did a study of what percentage of nonprofit of fundraisers, how do fundraisers feel about asking a donor for overhead, to cover overhead, or administrative costs. And so they studied with several hundred fundraisers, basically. This was recently. And about 80% of them said that they couldn't bring themselves to ask for administrative costs. And I thought, so when you're sitting across the table from them, do you really think they think you work for free and they want you to work for free? Because they don't. And so I found that to be just shocking, and that's something that we need to change.
Yeah. Okay. Lisa, you've put a lot of good things on the table. People have been enthusiastic in their responses, very attentive. We're moving this field ahead. It's great that your book is now out there for everybody. You're pushing people on both sides of the table to behave more thoughtfully and with more sophistication and honesty. And we look forward to continuing this discussion in future Limmuds and other good occasions. So thanks, everybody. Thank you so much for joining this Limmud Festival today. We look forward to seeing you at the road, whatever it's called, the Jewish Learning, in November, and the next Limmud Festival, which will be around Hanukkah time. So thanks, everybody, and all good wishes as we enter the fall season.